Hello and welcome back to financial advice from a children's fantasy novel. Could you survive on a wizard's salary? What even is a living in Harry Potter's world? What does the job market look like after you graduate Hogwarts? What do they even need to pay for? Well, good news, because today we're going to be ranking wizarding jobs. Which of them would have you using buy now, pay later for your Uber Eats, and which of them would let you live like a tech CEO? The Weasleys spent 700 galleons on a family vacation, and Draco's father bought brand new brooms for the entire Slytherin team. But none of this makes any sense because it might as well be Monopoly money. They don't have electricity bills, they can teleport anywhere at will. The cost of living is gonna be pretty hard to compare, maybe impossible. But at the end of the day, there are still poor people and there are still rich people in this world, so money has to matter in some way. So in order to rank any of these jobs, we're gonna have to set up some ground rules. So let's start with the currency. How much is a galleon even worth? Surprise, surprise, there's not a lot of information out there about this. There is one quote from J.K. Rowling in 2001 where she claims that a galleon is about equivalent to 5 British pounds. Was that in response to a question from a 5th grader? Maybe. Is it gonna change how I do my calculations for this video? You tell me a better way. I'm gonna adjust for inflation from the 1990s, and I'm gonna convert everything from pounds to US dollars, because who even knows what a British pound is worth? That's just some banter for my UK followers, isn't it? Don't worry about the math too much. When you hear 1 galleon, just pretend it means 15 US dollars. Don't like it? Make your own calculations and make your own video. Admittedly, there's gonna be some wacky results, like the fact that Harry buys a brand new wand in book 1 for 7 galleons, about $100, and that wand contains the feather from what is potentially the most rare and uncommon bird in the world. Certainly a feather would cost more than $100. So either Ollivander's just terrible at business, or could it be possible, hear me out, some of the logic in this story doesn't make complete sense. A couple other items to ground your sense of value in this world. A newspaper, 1 copy of the Daily Prophet, costs a single knut. I've been saying nut my entire life, and apparently the correct pronunciation of this word is knut. Whatever. Anyways, 1 knut is about 3 cents. A bottle of butterbeer is 2 sickles, which is about $1.76. It's a pretty good deal. It's only offset by the fact that Harry pays like $15 for 2 cups of coffee. Oh, yeah, I guess that's pretty much what it costs. And coming in at the absolute largest sum of money mentioned in this book is the bounty on Harry's head and his wand, which comes in at a combined 200,000 galleons, or approximately $3 million in cold, hard goblin cash. Gold. So, in order to make any sense of these wizarding careers, I'm going to sort them into 5 different socioeconomic classes. 1, the lowest class. Some might call it lower class. This is the poorest people in the wizarding society. 2, working class. This is the backbone of the wizarding world. They are probably paycheck to paycheck, and they very rarely, I would assume, really build any wealth. 3, middle class. These are your skilled professionals. I think you'd be comfortable here and probably could afford a couple vacations here and there. 4, upper class. These are witches and wizards that profit from the economic system within Harry Potter, which, to be absolutely crystal clear, is somewhere between feudalism, mercantilism, capitalism, and simultaneously a pre- and post-scarcity economy at the same time. Got it? And of course, tier 5, the ruling class. These people basically are the economic system. In order to sort these jobs, I've got a few criteria that I'm going to go through with each one and give them a low, medium, or high ranking. All of this lines up with a nifty little acronym that I definitely did not spend 10 hours trying to find the right words for. Coin. Cash, how much literal money do they make? Outlook, what's the sort of job security and career projections here? Influence, what level of influence do they have on society? And nonsense, which is basically my wild card plus or minus 1 for when I need to make some separation here. Confused? Don't worry, we'll get used to it. It's not that complicated, I promise. Grading rubric out of the way, ground rules set, open up your magical LinkedIn, and let's start looking at some of these jobs. Prank shop owner. Let's kick things off with the Weasley twins, Fred and George, infamous pranksters and the proprietors of their very own prank shop. Normally, I would say business owners would be a pretty clear shot at some sort of pretty respectable living, but how do things hold up in the wizarding economy? Let's take a look. The first thing I want to think about is how realistic any of it is. They very clearly get their seed money from Harry when he gives them 1,000 galleons, his Triwizard Tournament earnings, his winnings, which is approximately, by my math, about $15,000 in today's money. "Listen," said Harry firmly, "if you don't take it, I'm throwing it down the drain. I don't want it and I don't need it. But I could do with a few laughs. We could all do with a few laughs. I've got a feeling we're gonna need them more than usual before long." "Harry," said George weakly, weighing the money bag in his hands, "there's gotta be 1,000 galleons in here." "Yeah," said Harry, grinning. "Think how many canary creams that is." The twins stared at him. "Just don't tell your mom where you got it. Although she might not be so keen for you to join the ministry anymore, come to think of it." So Harry hands them a bag of all of his winnings, about $15,000, which is honestly quite generous. Now, $15,000 sounds like a lot at first, and it especially sounds like a lot for a bunch of teenagers, until you think about the fact that rent in a London flat right now is, I think, maybe about $3,000. Not to mention, this is after the fact that the Weasleys bet their life savings on the Quidditch World Cup. They bet about like 40 galleons, maybe $500. "We'll bet 37 galleons, 15 sickles, 3 nuts. Knuts," said Fred, as he and George quickly pooled all their money. "That Ireland wins, but Victor Crumb gets the snitch. Oh, and we'll throw in a fake wand." "You don't want to go showing Mr. Bagman rubbish like that," Percy hissed, but Bagman didn't seem to think the wand was rubbish at all. On the contrary, his boyish face shone with excitement as he took it from Fred, and when the wand gave a loud squawk and turned into a rubber chicken, Bagman roared with laughter. "Excellent, I haven't seen one that convincing in years. I'd pay 5 galleons for that." Percy froze in an attitude of stunned disapproval. "Boys," said Mr. Weasley under his breath, "I don't want you betting that's all your savings. Your mother." "Don't be a spoilsport, Arthur," boomed Ludo Bagman, rattling his pockets excitedly. "They're old enough to know what they want. You reckon Ireland will win, but Crumb will get the snitch? Not a chance, boys, not a chance. I'll give you excellent odds on that one. We'll add 5 galleons for the funny wand then, shall we?" Okay, couple things. So, we have literally no way to know what the odds actually are of this bet. All he really says is excellent odds. I'm guessing a bare minimum of 10 to 1. Frankly, it's a pretty insane wager that the one team is going to win, but the losing team is going to end it by catching the snitch. So I don't know, on the very high end, 100 to 1. Maybe it's an exaggeration, but either way, those 40 galleons would turn into either 400 or 4,000 if it pays out, which it should have, right? They got the wager correct. Ludo Bagman stole their money. And that 400 to 4,000 galleons would be equivalent to somewhere between 6,000 and 60,000 US dollars. Also, the fact that he gives them 5 galleons for the fake wand, remembering that Harry bought his real wand for 7 galleons. The pricing for actual objects in this world is probably the part that I'm going to ignore the most, because it just doesn't make a lick of sense anywhere. So moving on, how much cash does this business actually generate for the twins? We know that Harry's money was used for the lease, but how far does that go? Yeah, but that's the other thing. How do they get premises? Said Ron, hitting his teacup so hard with his wand that its legs collapsed again and it lay twitching before him. It's a bit dodgy, isn't it? They'll need loads of galleons to afford the rent on a place in Diagon Alley. She'll want to know what they've been up to get their hands on that sort of gold. Now, I have pulled some economic data from 2004 about retail rental prices in London. It looks like it'd be roughly 150 pounds per square meter, or like $20 per square foot. So even a 500 to 600 square foot space would cost a little over 10 grand a year. And that's in 2004's money. So good thing there's been no inflation since 2004. Anyway, I think Harry's galleons, his gift, would basically cover rent for about a year, which is still a pretty good gift. But they would need to keep the business running, right? So how much are they actually making from it? Let's assume the average cart value is about 5 galleons. That might be high, it might be low. There's no way to really know. They sell a bunch of things. Some are expensive, some are super cheap. We're gonna call it 5 galleons for the average purchase cart value, okay? I'm also going to assume they have about 1,500 regular customers. Those are Hogwarts alumni, their children, professors, Ministry of Magic employees, and then like whoever else works in this world. I don't know. It is very difficult to pin down any sort of population for this part of society. Not a whole lot of great answers here. J.K. Rowling says the population's like 3,000, but then there's the World Cup Stadium, which can fit like 100,000. I know that's the global population and whatever, but still, the numbers are not orders of magnitude off, whatever. So I'm going to assume there's about maybe actually like 10,000 in the UK. It's 10,000 that they could market their gifts and gags to, and they end up with about 1,500 of those regular customers. That is a pretty high penetration rate, but this is napkin math, so just go with it for a moment. With that in mind, I'm gonna estimate their lifetime value of a regular customer at around 25 galleons. These are pretty high estimates, I understand, but I don't think they're completely unreasonable. Bundle all of this up together, and I think in the 3 years that they're operating before the war, they maybe gross about 40,000 galleons. About $600,000. That's 3 years though. So if you split that into an annual revenue and take out pretty marginal costs, because I don't know what sort of material costs they have when everything is magic. Let's assume maybe 20%. There'd be some more costs in here, but I'm just estimating that each twin would walk away with about 5,000 galleons a year, or roughly 80K. So for cash, I'm gonna give them 3 out of 3. Now in terms of outlook, their sort of future proofing of their business, I think it's maybe a different story. Their customer base is fragile, and as soon as there's turmoil in the world, their business kind of goes away. You were in Hogsmeade? Asked Ginny, looking up. We were thinking of buying Zonko's, said Fred gloomily. A Hogsmeade branch, you know. But a fat lot of good it'll do us if you lot aren't allowed out at weekends to buy our stuff anymore. Turns out when there's a mass murderer on the loose, people don't spend a lot of money buying candy and love potions and goofs and bits. They're in a niche that is somewhat dependent on peace and disposable income. Two things which I don't think the wizarding world often has a lot of. So for their outlook, I'm giving them 1 point out of 3. Now in terms of their influence, I would wager that they probably have real respect within the community. They took a risk, they've succeeded, they don't have a huge inheritance from their parents or anything like that. They're probably not, rubbing elbows with the Malfoys, even if they're like cousins or whatever, but I don't think they have quite the same amount of influence as them. They're like the wizarding equivalent of a moderately successful Etsy seller or something like that. Someone that's opened a small shop in their local little community and has done pretty well. They're independent, they're probably admired, but they're probably not elite. So I'm gonna give them a 2 out of 3 on their influence score. And lastly, for nonsense, the wild card ranking. I'm going to give them a +1 purely based on the opportunity that comes with being an entrepreneur in this space. There's a chance that the brand could go more national or even global. I don't know, they could start mailing across the pond to wizards and witches in the US or across the rest of Europe. And also, Fred, not with the business anymore. George has actually doubled his income pretty much overnight. So silver lining and all of that, Canonically, J.K. Rowling says that the business has become a money spinner, which I'm assuming means it prints a lot of money. All in, I think this is a reasonably high income job, though it's not super stable and maybe moderate influence on society around them, plus a huge chance to grow. With all this in mind, I think this lands them and probably similar entrepreneurs in the middle class. Healers. Okay, I'll be honest, being a healer is a bit of a confusing career path within Harry Potter. You need top tier grades, 5 level E's in your Newt exams, just to even start to look at the job, and yet all the work is done magically. It's kind of like needing a doctorate just to feed chocolate to children. So let's just dive into things a little bit deeper. And we'll start by looking at the cash factor. I'll be honest, one thing that was a bit surprising to me when I was looking into this is just how little physicians in the UK are paid compared to the US. I mean, I think the average salary in the US is around $315,000, and in the UK, it seems like it's closer to $140 maybe. So honestly, I think that's kind of like something to keep in mind as we look at this career path, especially if you're a US-based viewer. Doctors don't make all that much over in the UK. There's probably some comments I could make about the US healthcare system, but that's not this video. Anyway, it's a highly skilled position. I don't think St. Mungo's is just hiring anybody, clearly not, because Ron tells us a little bit about what you need to be accepted. Well, I don't fancy healing, said Ron on the last evening of the holidays. He was immersed in a leaflet that carried the crossbone and wand emblem of St. Mungo's on its front. It says here that you need at least an E in Newt level in potions, herbology, transfiguration, charms, and defense against the dark arts. I mean, blimey, don't want much, do they? Well, it's a very responsible job, isn't it? Said Hermione absently. So to be clear, this is the same level of testing required to be an Auror. And without jumping the gun, I think the Auror job is a little bit better than the healer job. I think it's probably a little bit more lucrative, so long as you don't die. But one thing I want to think about with the cash aspect here is, where is the money actually coming from? St. Mungo's, by all accounts, seems to be some sort of public institution. I think if you work there, you're on some sort of fixed income. You're not billing for procedures or anything like that, which I think comes full circle with the type of pay that physicians and medical professionals get in the UK compared to the US. Again, insurance comments aside. But when you really think about it, I'm not sure what you're getting paid for to begin with. Potions and charms do pretty much all of the heavy lifting when you're a healer. A Pisky can heal seemingly most injuries, not all of them, but like a lot of them, just with a spell. So how much in that scenario can you realistically bill someone for if it's just something that you cast? They also have potions that do all the hard work for them. Skelligro regrows an entire bone structure overnight for Harry. The Pepper Up potion cures a cold instantly. And of course, there's Phoenix Tears, which I'm going to get to in a moment. You know, those pesky little things that cure every single possible illness and injury you have. It's just really hard to argue for a raise when evidently you can just put some bird juice on stuff and it fixes all your problems. With that in mind, I'm going to give the cash factor for a healer a 2 out of 3. Not terrible, but definitely not the best. From a job outlook perspective, this one's, I think, more hilarious than anything. I think wizards just can't help themselves and just continue to put themselves in ridiculous situations. Quidditch, for example, is an absurd sport that frankly should be really like the leading cause of mortality in this country. They, by all accounts, have zero sense of personal safety, and their national sport is flying around hundreds of feet in the air and like hurling cannonballs at each other, which does kind of beg the question. I don't think there's really a direct answer on this. Are wizards physiologically different than muggles in any way? Like, Quidditch would be a lethal sport. We have an example of Harry being hit in the head with either a quaffle or a bludger. I'll just read it. "Will you give him back his bat and get back to the goalposts?" roared Harry, pelting toward McLaggen just as McLaggen took a ferocious swipe at the bludger and mishit it. A blinding, sickening pain, a flash of light, distant screams, and the sensation of falling down a long tunnel. And the next thing Harry knew, he was lying in a remarkably warm and comfortable bed and looking up at a lamp that was throwing a circle of golden light onto a shadowy ceiling. "Cracked skull," said Madame Pumphrey, bustling up and pushing him back against his pillow. "Nothing to worry about. I mended it at once, but I'm keeping you in overnight. You shouldn't overexert yourself for a few hours." I understand that she probably immediately cast a spell or gave him a potion that fixed his skull, but like that, I think that would be like, Billy Mays got hit with like luggage on an airplane and that did him in. So like a giant cannonball to the head feels like it would be quite a devastating hit for most people. That said, if a cracked skull is only enough to keep you in overnight, it seems like there's probably quite a lot of turnover in the hospital wing, so you would at least always have a job to do, which is a good thing. There also doesn't seem to be too much taught about healing at Hogwarts for some reason, even though it's probably like the most incredible thing that magic can realistically do for most people on a day-to-day basis. It was stupid, pointless, irritating beyond belief that he still had 4 days left of being unable to perform magic, but he had to admit to himself that this jagged cut in his finger would have defeated him. He had never learned how to repair wounds, and now he came to think of it, Particularly in light of his immediate plans, this seemed a serious flaw in his magical education. This is Harry in Book 7, unable to heal the most basic of cuts, which is especially surprising given that he grew up as a muggle. He is probably the most aware of traditional medical practices compared to his wizarding cohorts who are probably terrified of band-aids. He should be able to take care of this even if he can't use magic. That said, either healers are incredibly rare in this world and specialists, or their education just is kind of terrible. Speaking of that specialization though, I don't know if there's any sort of career specialization for healers. It seems like most healers just kind of heal everything. Everyone can cast the same spells and use the same potions. So what exactly do you specialize in? Very specific dark magic curses or something like that? I suppose that could be one path to go, but I think most of the healers would just be generic nurses and primary care docs. They would just be good at doing the stuff that everyone else can do, which, to be clear, is covered by a few spells and a couple different potions. And of course, to top it all off, there are magical cure-alls like Phoenix Tears that just fix everything. So that kind of undermines your job security a little bit. There's a few pros and a few cons here. I'm gonna give their outlook a 2 out of 3. Again, right in the middle. Moving on to their influence though. This one I think is a little bit tough. There are, by all accounts, I don't think, really any Dr. Oz type characters in the wizarding world, healers that became, talk show host people. There probably are, and their name is probably Dr. McBlood Patch 'em Up or something like that, but we don't ever know about them. Madame Pomfrey, for instance, gives the vibes of sort of competent school nurse, but doesn't probably own a lake house. Harry, who spends just about every year in the hospital wing, probably can't tell you the name of any healers besides Madame Pomfrey. I don't think their reputation really extends all that far. So with that in mind, I'm giving them a 1 out of 3 for the influence factor. And then lastly, we move on to the nonsense factor, which I think is a mixed bag. There is obviously this very persistent issue of something like Phoenix Tears, which completely undermines everything that you've trained and studied for, because if you can get the bird to cry, you just fix all the problems. Honestly, this is the one that has me wondering, what realistically would something like this, Phoenix Tears, what role would they play in a society like this? It's a strange situation where you legitimately do have a cure-all, this silver bullet, and it's not like our colloidal silver that's gonna poison you slowly and not do anything to help anything. You have Phoenix Tears that legitimately fix most injuries. It cures Harry's poisoning from the basilisk, which is the most deadly poison mentioned in this story. It destroys Horcruxes. It's incredibly dangerous, and yet Phoenix Tears solve the problem, right? You would think you'd have a system of trying to either to synthesize that magic in some way to really capture what Phoenix Tears are doing, or I don't know, an assembly line of birds that you're trying to make cry somehow and get more tears out. I don't know exactly how the tears happen, but birds don't normally cry, so who knows? All that to say, it's a weird situation where you have someone that is a healer and yet you have a thing that completely negates the purpose of that person's job. You just have to find a way to get more of it. So all in, I'm giving the nonsense factor a 0, not a +1 or a -1. We'll keep it at 0, which totals up to a grand score of 5, which puts them very comfortably in the middle class tier of society. I think there's a relatively high barrier to becoming a healer. You have probably pretty capped earning potential, and you're probably not gonna influence society in a way that new laws are introduced or anything like that, but people probably like you and you're probably quite qualified, despite the fact that a bird can still do things that you can't. Middle class. The Wizard Cop Career Ladder. Moving on to something that's going to be a bit of a combo. I don't know that all of these jobs necessarily lead into the next one, but I felt like I just had to sort of combine them because there wasn't going to be a great way to talk about all of these at the same time. So this is going to talk about hit wizards, Aurors, and the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Basically, all the types of wizard cops that exist. We'll start with the description of hit wizards, which I think are basically the equivalent of SWAT team members. So probably highly violent individuals with a reputation for domestic assault in the magical world. You don't know what you're talking about, Hagrid, said Fudge sharply. Nobody but trained hit wizards from the magical law enforcement squad would have stood a chance against Black once he was cornered. I was junior minister in the Department of Magical Catastrophes at the time, and I was one of the first on the scene after Black murdered all those people. I will never forget it. I still dream about it sometimes. A crater in the middle of the street, so deep it had cracked the sewer below. Bodies everywhere, muggles screaming, and Black standing there laughing with what was left of Pettigrew in front of him. So this is like the job description, essentially. I think you would be tasked with at least trying to stop people like the alleged Sirius Black in this situation. So you're kind of going in as a first responder to diffuse or disrupt a situation like this. Following that, I think if you were a potentially good enough hit wizard and you sort of graduate on from that or get a promotion, you could potentially end up as an Auror, which has a little bit more clerical work and a little bit more detective work, but I think is otherwise somewhat similar. Maybe you'd fight worse bad guys as part of that role. Although I'm not totally sure how you get this job, because it seems like most of these roles are decided by your scores on a test that you take at age 17, which I guess is not too dissimilar from the rest of the world. Do they have post-grad situations in Hogwarts? Is there college for Harry Potter? I don't know. Anyway, here's McGonagall describing the requirements to become an Auror. Well, I thought of maybe being an Auror, Harry mumbled. You'd need top grades for that, said Professor McGonagall, extracting a small dark leaflet from under the mass on her desk and opening it. They ask for a minimum of 5 newts, and nothing under exceeds expectation grade, I see. Then you'd be required to undergo a stringent series of character and aptitude tests at the Auror office. It's a difficult career path, Potter. They only take the best. In fact, I don't think anyone has been taken on in the last 3 years. I mean, that kind of answers the question. I guess there's more like apprenticeship, like journeyman type of situations for your life after Hogwarts. Most careers, it seems like you go on and study under someone else's tutelage on the job rather than going to college, which is not the worst. It's basically like a bunch of trade programs, I guess. And then finally, we have the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It's the job where you don't actually go out and fight people anymore, you just send people out to fight for you. Sounds like a pretty good gig. It's also a role that I think has been filled at least a few times by former Aurors. So I think the progression potentially from good hit wizard to Auror to potentially head of Department of Magical Law Enforcement is a realistic one. So on to the cash factor. The hit wizard is one of the rare instances where we have actual written numbers to describe how much this job pays. It comes from a very, very early on piece of marketing that J.K. Rowling put out that were called the Daily Prophet newsletters. And I think early adopters could sign up or pay for this, and they got physical letters in the mail that describe this. I'm not totally sure. It's very hard to track down even screenshots of these that are bigger than like 2 pixels across. But the description from that newsletter describes a job opening for a hit witch or wizard. Hit witch or wizard for the Magical Law Enforcement Squad. Bored by routine wand work? Looking for more thrills? The Magical Law Enforcement Squad would like to hear from you. The job requirements: 17 years of age or older, 5 or more owls, including defense against the dark arts, not of nervous disposition. The benefits include starting salary of 700 galleons per month, Ministry of Magic broomstick, regular bed at St. Mungo's. I will admit, this is one of the instances where my numbers completely break down, because 700 galleons is equivalent to roughly 10 grand a month, which is a pretty high paying job, especially considering the fact that this is like an entry-level position. So realistically, I think this was written so early in the development of Harry Potter that J.K. Rowling had no sense of not that this changed later, but I don't think she had any sense of what the currency meant in this world at that point in time. I think things are more consistent in the future, but I think really early on, I don't think this is super balanced. This is doubly true because directly beneath this is a job offering for a dragon feeder, which pays 7 galleons a week, which is roughly like $400 a month. I think there's a more like comical job offerings shown here rather than like take this as the truth of the job market in this situation. So with that in mind, for hit wizards, I'm gonna give it a 1 out of 3, just because I know there are roles above this that have to have a higher grade here. I don't think this is realistically paying quite as much as it might appear at first blush. Now for the Aurors, we know that there is some additional training that goes into this. Not only do you need super high scores, you also then go into a program where you are specially trained for another 3 years after the fact to become an Auror. So I think with that specialized training comes potentially a higher salary, and therefore I'm going to give an Auror a 2 out of 3. And for the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, I'm going to realistically give that a 3 out of 3. You are potentially next in line to become Minister of Magic. That has happened a few times as well. So presumably, if your next job is head of wizarding politics, your current job can't be paying all that bad. So 3 out of 3 for that one. When it comes to outlook, basically your job security, I think, again, Hit Wizard is ranking pretty low here. I'm going to give this a 1 out of 3 because it's a pretty extremely dangerous job. This job is probably advertising in newspapers because people are often dying and there's quite a lot of turnover for the position. So I'm going to give Hit Wizards a 1 out of 3. For Aurors, I'm going to give this a 2 out of 3. I think it's realistically quite a secure position, but also still quite dangerous. We know from McGonagall that they haven't taken anyone in 3 years, so realistically, it's a pretty select group of people that get brought in. I think if you make it in, you probably have a good future, as long as you don't die. So I'll give that one a 2 out of 3. And then for the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, again, I think that's you're second to the Ministry of Magic here. I think this is a 3 out of 3 for your job outlook here. I think it's a pretty stable position to be in. You're 1 under the Minister of Magic. You probably don't have to go out and fight quite as much as Aurors and Hit Wizards do, so I don't think you're in quite as much danger. You probably get paid pretty well as well, so I think your outlook is a 3 out of 3 for the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. That is a mouthful every single time. And lastly, for influence, Hit Wizards, again, we're given the lowest score for this. This is a 1 out of 3. They basically are just cannon fodder. They get sent in to try to clear things up. Maybe they're quite skilled. Potentially they're quite skilled, but I really don't think they have a lot of influence on anybody. They're basically like the shock troops. They're like helldivers. They just get sent in to try to clear things up. Aurors, on the other hand, I think have quite a lot of influence in society. I think these people are really seen as the most elite sort of soldier / detective cops in the universe, in the wizarding universe here. There's some more quotes about Harry and Ron being impressed by Aurors. I don't think that says a whole lot because Harry and Ron are 14 and of course they're impressed by these people, but I do think Aurors probably command a lot of respect in the wizarding society. And lastly, of course, the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. This, again, I think is going to be a 3 out of 3. This is the type of job that, again, you have so much leverage here being directly under the Minister of Magic that it's quite obvious that your influence is just on a different level. And this is backed up by Barty Crouch Sr. and the things that he did when he was the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Well, times like that bring out the best in some people and the worst in others. Crouch's principles might have been good in the beginning, I wouldn't know. He rose quickly through the ministry, and he started ordering very harsh measures against Voldemort's supporters. The Aurors were given new powers to kill rather than capture, for instance. And I wasn't the only one who was handed straight to the Dementors without trial. Crouch fought violence with violence, and authorized the use of the unforgivable curses against suspects. I would say he became as ruthless and cruel as many on the dark side. This is like quite a lot of influence. You're creating a bunch of like James Bond agents that are able to go out and pretty much be judge, jury, and executioner just based on what you think is right in the moment. You have the influence to shape this sort of societal reaction to the war. I think you're realistically 1 step below the Minister of Magic and a pretty big step above just about everyone else in your department. So 3 out of 3 there. And of course, lastly, for the nonsense score, Hit Wizards, giving them a 0. It's just chaos. I don't know. These are like frat dudes that can cast spells good. I don't know. They're getting a 0. No bonus points here. Aurors, I'm giving them a +1 because of the sort of influence that they have and the respect that they probably command in society. They're also some of the only wizards that get to cast spells and do things with impunity, so kind of a +1 for that. They're basically like the inquisitors that can do no wrong. And then lastly, for the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, this one I'm actually giving a -1 purely based on getting potentially sucked into the political drama. Rufus Scrimgeour, previously head of the Auror office in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, has succeeded Cornelius Fudge as Minister of Magic. The appointment has largely been greeted with enthusiasm by the wizarding community, though rumors of a rift between the new minister and Albus Dumbledore, newly reinstated chief warlock of the Wizengamot, I hate this word, surfaced within hours of Scrimgeour taking office. So granted, he is in the Minister of Magic role here, but very clearly this is the next position you take here, and so I think even though you're probably shielded from most of the politics, being the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement means you probably have to play the politics game at least a little bit, which for every reason possible, I'm giving a -1 for the nonsense score here. Which means overall, Hit Wizards, I am giving a 3, which puts them in the lower class area. I think this is realistic. They are doing probably a super dangerous job. I really don't think they should be getting paid that much. I think a lot of them probably die. It's not a great job, but they get to probably go on a bunch of vacations to fight bad wizards. So, you know, for those of us that want to travel, that's an opportunity. For Aurors, I would give them 7 points, which would put them pretty cleanly in the middle class to probably on the upper end of middle class. I think they're probably pretty elite in society. I think they probably have more respect than they do money, but it's probably still a pretty good job. Then lastly, for the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, I would give that role probably an 8. I think this would put you in the upper class. You probably make a decent amount of money. Your job's pretty stable. You have an insane amount of influence on what people around you can do, what the government's doing. There's some downsides to all of that, but overall, I think you're living pretty large if you're the head of a department in the Ministry of Magic. So I'm gonna give that one 8, give it upper class. Too many numbers flying around. Give that one a 4 stars. So you have the whole continuum here. You start in the lower class, and if you work really, really hard, you can eventually get promoted enough that maybe you're making ends meet and you're the head of a department. Good for you. Quick reminders before we move on to the next one. If you're liking this content, subscribe, press the like button, put some comments in there. I really appreciate all of it. It helps the video get pushed out more. Hopefully you're liking the content. If you are, there's a few different ways you can support me. I do have memberships enabled on the channel, which means you get access to videos a couple days earlier than the rest of everyone else. You get membership badges and emojis and all of the fun stuff. It's just one way that you can support me so that I can make more content for you. If you don't want to use YouTube, there's also memberships available on Patreon, where I'll post videos without ads. Lastly, I also have a Discord available for the channel. I should have a link, I don't know, on screen or in the description or something like that. You can find it. So check that out if you're interested. All right, I think that's everything. Thanks for watching. Back to the video. Oh, what time is it? It's time for the speed round. I actually considered adding in cash cab lights and flashes. I don't know if I figured that out in the edit, but if I did, way to go me. All right, there were so many jobs that really just had such little information about them that I wasn't gonna be able to do a whole section about it, but I still wanted to talk about them. So for this, I'm gonna rank 5 of them rapid fire, like 30 seconds tops, based on the little bits of information that we have. So starting off, Unspeakables. This is the top secret job that happened in the ministry. They work in the Department of Mysteries at the bottom of the Ministry of Magic. I think this is probably a pretty good job. You work in like the most unique and interesting area of the whole wizarding world. You're seeing magic that's like simultaneously cutting edge, but also like weird ancient magic. I think it's probably the most intriguing and interesting part of the wizarding world to live in. I don't know if you're paid all that much. You probably are. I think you have to be pretty skilled and elite to be in this type of role. So with that in mind, I'm gonna give this one actually a upper class ranking, a 4 out of 5. Moving on to wand maker / craftsman. This is kind of a catch-all for some of the entrepreneurial roles. I know I ranked the Weasley twins. This is a little bit different, mainly because I think wand makers, scratch that, at least Ollivander is potentially the worst businessman in the wizarding community. He is making what is essentially the most vital part of being a witch or wizard, a wand, which almost everyone needs to do all magic, and yet he charges next to nothing for the wands. Not to mention the fact that all the materials that go into the wands have to cost more than what he's charging for them in the first place. He sells Harry a wand for 7 galleons. Again, that's like $100. I'm certain that like parts of a dragon heart are more expensive than $100. Just doesn't make any sense. He's taking a loss on everything. I'm giving Ollivander and wand makers like him a 1 out of 5 stars, a lower class ranking. he needs a business advisor. He needs like Gordon Ramsay, Hell's Kitchen, but for wand makers to jump on there to help him out. Up next, Dragonologist. This is a real word for this job, which sounds vaguely familiar, and I just can't put my finger on it.
The study of Wumbo?
Oh, yeah, that one, Dragonology, right. I think this is probably a reasonable job. It's a job that's kind of like a skilled trade and profession. You're probably quite specialized. I don't think there's a lot of people trying to take your job from you, and you're dealing with, you know, one of the most dangerous animals in the wizarding world, so I think you're probably compensated for it somewhat well. That said, I think you're sort of more in that like zookeeper range of salaries and stuff, so I'm gonna give this like a working class score, probably a 2 out of 5. Probably super interesting work, but I just don't think you're probably making all that much coin. And lastly, the custodial / caretaker role. This is like the Filch and Hagrid of the world. Filch probably makes a little bit less than Hagrid. I think this also kind of goes into the fact that Filch is a squib, and I don't think squibs probably get paid all that much in wizarding society, which does kind of suck. I mean, he can't get a job as a muggle because that doesn't make any sense for him. And why would you want to if you could live in a magical world? But you're probably not making all that much, nor do you have any influence, nor does anyone respect you. I think you're probably kind of a 1 out of 5 star poverty level job if you're Filch. If you're Hagrid, I think you're probably a little bit more respected, not a whole lot, but you also have access to all of the magical creatures, and Hagrid's not taking advantage of it, but you could be selling all these resources to Ollivander, who's just, you take him to the cleaners, man. I don't know. Hagrid's role, probably a little bit higher than Filch. I'll give him 2 out of 5 stars, very much in the working class world. And that does it for the speed round. All right, back to our regularly scheduled content. Ministry of Magic employee. Okay, this one is distinct from the wizard cops that we've already done. This is like the average ministry paper pushing job, right? Not the cops, just the guys that fill out paperwork and clock in and out. So in a similar fashion, I'm gonna split this into sort of 2 rankings. One is your sort of entry level position here, and one is the upper range of where you could potentially take a career with the ministry. Starting with the cash factor. Arthur Weasley is sort of my best case for understanding how much these jobs pay. Despite the fact that he's incredibly broke, he is supporting a family of like 700. So there is, you know, I think his money is being spent in a way that others might not be spending it. That said, he wins a lottery in like book 2 or 3, I can't remember, 700 galleons, and spends it all on vacation. So needless to say, he is probably not the best case for understanding how you should be spending your money. That said, he does still need this lottery to pay for going on this vacation, so that would imply to me that in his initial position within the ministry, at least what he's doing when we first meet him, they're probably not paying all that much. I think it's probably steady, and he's not gonna get fired or laid off anytime soon, but it's like an entry-level government position. I think realistically he's making probably in like the, I don't know, 60 to 70K range. Certainly pretty low to support the size of family that he has, but you know, again, they can turn tables into food potentially. The costs are a little bit different. And we know a little bit more about them because Muggle relations, which is not exactly Arthur's job, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's related to his job. We do have a description of what you need to take that role. And this is all based on the pamphlets that the trio is reading in Order of the Phoenix about potential career options when they graduate. She was poring over the bright pink and orange leaflet that was headed, "So you think you'd like to work in Muggle relations? You don't seem to need many qualifications to liaise with Muggles. All they want is an owl in Muggle studies. Much more important is your enthusiasm, patience, and a good sense of fun. You need more than a good sense of fun to liaise with my uncle," said Harry darkly. So this is seemingly like a backup job. It's like if you can't do anything else, you can do Muggle relations, which is probably on the lowest end of what you get paid for when you work at the Ministry of Magic. But there's a couple other jobs that we know a little bit about within the Ministry of Magic. One other one, for example, might be an Obliviator, which is like a senior bureaucrat probably level thing. I anticipate it being somewhere between Hit Wizard and Auror. You have like a specific role and you're probably quite respected, but you're probably not raking in the big bucks. Fudge Grimmist He used giants last time when he wanted to go for the grand effect, he said. The Office of Misinformation has been working around the clock. We've had teams of Obliviators out trying to modify the memories of all the Muggles who saw what really happened. We've got most of the Department of Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures running around Somerset, but we can't find the giant. It's been a disaster. Granted, Obliviators probably have to go and do jobs like without any notice, and it's probably an emergency every time an Obliviator gets called in, so the job itself is not great, but I think the pay is probably reasonable. That in mind, I think most ministry jobs, you're probably looking at a 2 out of 3 on the cash factor here. Now, when it comes to the job outlook, I think it's actually quite interesting. The Ministry of Magic is in like volatile upheaval every few years, so I think your outlook is actually kind of tricky here. Arthur Weasley has maintained his job for a long time, but honestly, I think it's probably more out of plot convenience than like what realistically would be kept open. He's in probably the least respected position he could be in. Dad was working overtime for weeks. The teapot went berserk and squirted boiling tea all over the place, and one man ended up in hospital with the sugar tongs clamped to his nose. Dad was going frantic. It's only him and an old warlock called Perkins in the office. They had to do memory charms and all sorts to cover it up. Arthur's job is a bit of a dead end, even though I think there's a quote somewhere that I couldn't find about him repeatedly passing up promotions just to keep working with Muggle stuff. That said, I think your path to a better job is not super common in the ministry. I think you're often probably stuck in the same position for a long time. Maybe if you're like really a go-getter, you have a path and you can like buddy up with, you know, the old guard and find a way to get a promotion. But I think on the low end, you got a 1 out of 3 for your outlook here. And on the high end, if you're like a go-getter Percy Weasley style, maybe you get a 2 out of 3. But overall, I think it's a job path where you have stability, but not a ton of upper end mobility. And lastly, on the influence factor, this is again a mixed bag. I think on the low end, you have maybe a 1 out of 3. You're just a paper pusher. No one respects you. You don't do a whole lot. You're just there to collect a paycheck and move on. But on the high end, I think you do start to have some influence over society. I mean, you are in the ministry, so you clearly are connected with others that are making decisions that matter. It just kind of matters what your position is. And I don't really know if that is determined more by your qualifications or by your like blood purity. It feels like a lot of the times Arthur Weasley is only really known because he is one of the few remaining pureblood families left. So if you were just any Joe Schmo wizard, I don't get the sense that many people would respect you in most cases here. So on the low end, giving you a 1. On the high end, giving you a 2 out of 3. And then finally for the nonsense factor, I think on the low end, you're pushing paper every day. It's monotonous. You collect a paycheck, you go home, you get 0. On the high end, you've got some kind of inside track here to new developments in magic. You know more about like time turners and weird ancient magic that happens down in the basement because you can, you know, gossip at the water cooler or whatever. So for that, I'm giving you a +1 for your sort of insider information factor here. And you can maybe use some of that chaos to your advantage if you are really sort of cunning about it. Which means for your final score, I think on the low end, you're looking at 2 stars, sort of a working class level, which makes sense to me. And on the high end, again, not all the way up to Minister of Magic level, but, you know, probably not department head, but like reasonably respected in the ministry. You got some sort of tenure. You're probably looking at the middle class range here. Nothing that's like blowing your socks off, but I think you got a reasonable living going on. And if Arthur didn't spend all of his earnings on vacation and like just managed to barely save enough to buy a new wand for Ron, maybe he wouldn't be in such dire straits all the time. But that's less about his job and more about his spending habits. So Caleb Hammer can do a financial audit of all the Harry Potter characters. That sounds like not a bad video, actually. House Elves. Okay, so this is one I just kind of had to do because there just happens to be some financial information in the books about them. Very obviously, you know where house elves are going, but I'm still gonna do it pretty quick just to get the information out there. Some of the only canon wage information we get is from Dobby. We know that Dumbledore offered Dobby 10 galleons a week to do some tasks around Hogwarts, which is apparently a very generous salary for him. So much so that Dobby pushes back and instead of 10 galleons a week, negotiates a whopping 4 galleons a month instead. And then Dobby had the idea, Harry Potter, sir. Professor Dumbledore offered Dobby 10 galleons a week and weekends off, said Dobby, suddenly giving a little shiver, as though the prospect of so much leisure and riches were frightening. But Dobby beat him down, miss. Dobby likes freedom, miss, but he isn't wanting too much, miss. He likes work better. I don't necessarily want to spend all that much time on the House Elves portion of this video, because it's like, whatever. But it is still worth mentioning, because I don't know if that makes Dumbledore better or worse. 10 galleons a week, 40 galleons a month. What is that, like $600 a month? Not in unreasonable salary. Granted, they have room and board probably at Hogwarts, so he doesn't have to pay for a whole lot. What I don't know about this is if it says anything about what professors are paid at Hogwarts. And we'll get into professors later, but if Dobby's being offered 40 galleons a month, I have to imagine professors are making a significant amount more than that, which, we'll get into it later. I'm giving House Elves a 0 for cash factor here for obvious reasons. Moving on to Outlook. This one is just as bad. I think House Elves live an extraordinarily long time and they are just slaves. So the outlook on your job, even though you're going to have job stability, you're never going to get paid for it, which is, not great. The main reason I wanted to bring this up is because of the concept of house elves. It had me thinking, are there other types of elves in the Harry Potter universe? Are they all house elves, or are they just are there, free roaming elves that have their own society outside of the one that's based in London, right? Logically, it seems like there should be, unless they're a completely created species that's been enslaved completely. And I think there's a few hints to the fact that there might be other elves in the universe. For instance, there's this quote in Half-Blood Prince between Snape and Peter Pettigrew. "Of course you can," said Snape, sneering, "but in the meantime, bring us drinks. Some of the elf-made wine will do." And then later in Half-Blood Prince, there's Slughorn and Hagrid talking. After an hour or so, Hagrid and Slughorn began making extravagant toasts to Hogwarts, to Dumbledore, to elf-made wine. So there are things made by elves, and I don't know if they would be made by house elves or if this is implying that it's made by free elves or a different society of elves that wizards have to barter with to get elf-made wine from. Anyway, I'm giving elves a 1 only because there's a slim chance that they can be set free and don't have to work as slaves for their entire lives. So I'll give them a 1 out of 3 and call it good there. From an influence perspective, very obviously, this is also a 0. They have absolutely no influence in society. No one treats them as real beings that have feelings or autonomy. This is a 0 out of 3. Move on from that. From the nonsense wildcard perspective, I am going to give them a +1 only because they have unique magic that seems distinct and different from what wizards and witches can do. There is some sort of hidden power there that maybe there should be a spinoff that someone could do. I think it's interesting that they can do completely different and powerful magic that seems to undermine all the protections and limits that wizards have. So giving them +1 for that. All in, this puts him very obviously with 2 points in lower class. We all knew I was going to give him a 1-star rating, but I mainly just wanted to talk about the fact that there might be other elves out there, and nobody ever talks about that. They all just talk about the house elves. But what about all of the Aragon elves that are out there making wine for everybody? No one talks about that stuff. Drug dealers. All right, you pretty much can't talk about this topic within Harry Potter without at least mentioning the black market. There is, of course, the Nocturne Alley portion of this conversation, and I might touch on it, but the thing I really want to talk about is the idea of the low-level drug dealer within Harry Potter, because I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about here. This all stems from a pretty small portion of Order of the Phoenix, during which Harry and Ron are offered, along with many other students, some sort of performance-enhancing drug for their upcoming tests, the Owls, that year. It's again one of the rare moments where we have actual monetary values to assign to something that happens to the main characters. So I wanted to use those numbers and apply them to a somewhat real-world scenario and see just how things line up. So that's where we're going to start with the cash factor. Meanwhile, a flourishing black market trade in aids to concentration, mental agility, and wakefulness had sprung up among the 5th and 7th years. Harry and Ron were much tempted by the bottle of Barufio's brain elixir offered to them by Ravenclaw's 6th year, Eddie Carmichael, who swore it was solely responsible for the 9 outstanding owls he had gained the previous summer, and was offering the whole pint for a mere 12 galleons. So, 12 galleons, is that a reasonable price in a competitive market for what is essentially the wizarding equivalent of magical Adderall? 12 galleons, adjusted based on what I think the conversion rate is right now, is about $180. That's a pint of brain juice, whatever they're drinking, and it's split in two, half for Harry and half for Ron. So each of them is paying about $90 for half a pint of this stuff that should get them through all of their tests this year. It's not totally clear, of course it isn't, but what I don't know is whether or not this is for them to use while they study, or if it's just something that they're gonna take on the day of the test. So for my purposes, I'm gonna assume they're both getting about 5 doses, roughly, for the tests that they're gonna take this year, which comes out to about $20 a dose. Kind of allegedly, possibly in line with the going rate for another concentration improving medicine in the Muggle world. Weirdly enough, this is one area where the Harry Potter Potternomics seem to pretty much hold true. What about other potions? What about other drugs? There's not really any other information about other similar types of drugs. Love potions, for example, students are getting them in kind of the same way, so I imagine the pricing on those is probably similar, but the question I really have is, what about the harder stuff? I mean, at least in the wizarding sense. Like, there's definitely a black market for things like Polyjuice Potion that would be like pre-made and ready to go. You just need to add a little bit of DNA from somebody to make it work. That feels like it would have a pretty high going rate, and I can imagine, granted, you'd have to be a pretty good potion maker to get it to that state and ready to sell, but that seems like a pretty profitable gig. No indication on whether or not any of that's illegal, but I have to assume there are some laws around it. And of course, what about liquid luck? I can practically hear the comments through the walls right now about how, they'd never be able to make it. No one could ever make it. It's way too hard to make. Yada, yada, yada. It takes 6 months to brew. You know what else takes 6 months to brew? Most alcohol. You know what takes a lot longer than 6 months? Most fine alcohols and spirits. This is not a ridiculous boundary and barrier to overcome. So I understand there's skill involved with the potion, but we also have seen examples of potions made correctly and successfully. So therefore, somebody's able to make it. I understand it's difficult to make. It clearly is not impossible. And regardless, people sell bad drugs all the time. There would definitely be faulty, like 10% only partially functioning liquid luck potions that would be peddled by someone in the black market. Maybe you find a couple canuts on the ground or something. But imagine you're like the high-end dealer. You probably have a hookup to something that is super, super high purity and would presumably sell for quite a bit. There are, I'm sure, designer drugs in the Harry Potter world. I mean, how much would you pay for a perfect day? Hard to put a price on that. So all in, I would give the cash factor a medium value here at 2 out of 3. It's not taxed. You're probably not making a whole bunch of money. It's probably more like a side hustle thing for most of them, but I have to imagine there are folks that are probably making quite a bit. There is probably, I would assume, some sort of Walter White figure within Harry Potter that is like a kingpin for wizard paraphernalia. I'm positive. There has to be. There just has to be. Moving on to the outlook section of the grading rubric. This one is a little bit more bleak, I think. At the very least, for the student level offender, this is what happens if you get caught breaking the rules and get expelled. Oh, well, I was at Hogwarts myself, but I got expelled, to tell you the truth, in my 3rd year. They snapped my wand in half and everything. That's Hagrid recounting himself getting expelled, and the consequences of that are that they snap your wand. And it's told in such a way that it appears like you're sort of blacklisted from getting a wand after the fact, or at least until you're an adult. So it kind of shuts off all future career paths if you get expelled from Hogwarts. And if you don't graduate from Hogwarts, I don't know what you do with the rest of your life. It's the only place you can learn any magic, it seems like. So if you do get expelled, I think your future's like pretty bleak. So I'm gonna give this a 1 out of 3 for the outlook section of this. Also, if you get caught doing this as an adult, I would assume maybe it wouldn't be that bad, but I'm kind of wondering if the consequences as an adult dealer, depending on what you're dealing, could be Azkaban, which is a pretty bad punishment. So the outlook is especially bleak even after you graduate. Moving on to influence, again, not super great. You're kind of operating on the edges of society if you really roll in this kind of crowd. You might be used by multiple people. You might even feel important to some of those people. You might even have high-end clientele that are coming to you frequently, but none of them want to be associated with you. You're a dealer. So for that reason alone, I think the influence score has to be a 1 out of 3. And lastly, for the wildcard nonsense section of this, there's a couple things to weigh. On the pros side, I guess you have access to, I don't know, call it paraphernalia again, things that are potentially beneficial to you, but I do think if you start, tasting your own supply, you're gonna go down a pretty rough rabbit hole potentially. Plus, the consequences for being caught in a society like Harry Potter seem much more draconian than even the United States of America. So I have to assume that it could be pretty bad for you. I'm giving your nonsense factor here a -1, leaving you with a total score of 3, which puts you pretty squarely in the lower class ranking, which, I think that's to be expected. Even if you're making pretty high margins on the things that you're selling to the especially well-off wizards, I'm sure the Minister of Magic here or there has dabbled in things. Those margins don't really mean a whole lot if you get sent to get your soul sucked out by Dementors, so I think a 3 is a pretty reasonable score for them. It's not a great career path. You should probably finish school. Curse Breaker. This is a job that I really wanted to get to. I think it's probably one of the more interesting jobs mentioned in the series, and honestly, on paper, it sounds a little bit like an Indiana Jones type career. He was halfway through a pamphlet on wizard banking. Listen to this. Are you seeking a challenging career involving travel, adventure, and substantial danger-related treasure bonuses? Then consider a position with Gringotts Wizarding Bank, who are currently recruiting curse breakers for thrilling opportunities abroad. They want arithmancy, though. You could do it, Hermione. I don't much fancy banking, said Hermione vaguely. So as we move into this cash section, I think it is basically the sort of Indiana Jones type job. I'm not an expert on Indiana Jones though, so I don't exactly know how much he's making. It seems like he's paid more often in sort of like, artifacts and experiences rather than like cash. That said, the one person we know working in this position is Bill Weasley, and technically he works for Gringotts. He's not just sort of like an independent curse breaker. So kind of similar to an Indiana Jones character, maybe he pockets like a cursed amulet here and there, but realistically I think he's pulling a salary of some kind. And again, it mentions treasure-related bonuses. I don't know if that means you get the treasure or you get the value of the treasure given to you. Not clear. You're somewhere between like private equity bro and Indiana Jones. I can't really picture Indiana Jones being replaced with a finance bro, but I don't know. This sounds like a TikTok skit more than anything. That said, the fact that you are bankrolled by Gringotts, I think fundamentally means you're probably being paid pretty well. And I think realistically, I have to give this job a 3 out of 3 for the cash factor, because you are basically a bank employee. I'm sure you're being paid handsomely, especially because of all the danger that you're partaking in. I'm sure you're getting paid decently well. Now, from an outlook perspective, this is kind of an interesting job. I would imagine people that are curse breakers and have a successful career in curse breaking are probably top of the line for some sort of high-level department head at the Ministry of Magic. I can imagine having curse breaker on your resume is only a positive. Not only do you deal with magical danger, which seems to be like the way people get positions of power in this world, is being a better dueler, you're also pretty well connected to the financial part of the universe, which is completely controlled by your employer, the Gringotts foundation. So that also can't be a bad thing. I think on the con side, there is obviously risk. You're dealing with cursed objects and other sort of safeguards for treasure constantly. So I think that's a pretty real danger. I mean, Malfoy gets a cursed amulet that almost kills someone at a store on a whim. So, cursed objects I don't think are that uncommon in this world. While the career is probably stable and offers some pretty good opportunities, I do think the risk factor would knock a point off the score here, so I'm gonna give it a 2 out of 3 for the outlook section. From an influence perspective, a Cursebreaker's kind of a specialist role. You're not necessarily leading a team or anything like that. You're highly specialized for doing one very specific thing. I know they ask for arithmancy, and that's basically the magical word for math. I guess that's like finance math in this sense, but I think really you're sort of an individual contributor in this sense. You go out, you like solve the curse puzzles and get the treasure. I think you're basically probably stealing treasure from wherever you're going out. Bill's traveling to Egypt and essentially raiding tombs to get treasures, but like on a scale from a like respected field researcher to a politician, I think you're closer to that researcher level of influence. At the end of the day, a Cursebreaker is probably a respected figure in society, but probably not a very authoritative one. I will give the influence factor also a 2 out of 3. From the nonsense wildcard score, it's a mixed bag. On one hand, on the pro side, I think you have access to some magical artifacts that could potentially really boost your magical prowess, I suppose, but I think very much on the flip side, half of those things, and maybe even more by nature of what you're doing, are gonna be cursed. And magical curses don't seem to be the type of thing that you can like easily unravel. Again, because Harry Potter doesn't have like a hard magic system necessarily. It's not like you can understand exactly what the curse is all the time. So the risk seems quite high for this case. So all in all, I think it's gonna even out and give you just a good old 0 in the nonsense score here. But all in all, that leaves you at a pretty high final score. 7 out of 10. I think you're very squarely in the middle class, probably on the upper side of middle class. You might not be paid extremely handsomely, but you're also getting a ton of other benefits for travel and whatever the treasure-related bonuses might be. I think you're living a pretty modest life, so I really think this is not a bad job if you can handle doing math and taking potentially somewhat large risks occasionally. This feels like the kind of job that when you retire after a successful career and you manage to make it, 35, 40 years as a Cursebreaker, if that ever happens, it seems like you would be someone that would be full of crazy stories, which, it's its own reward, I guess. Granted, I do feel like there's always the opportunity that you stumble across some sort of treasure that is like monumental in a way that would just prompt you to steal it and run away. Like imagine you run into the Philosopher's Stone buried somewhere. I feel like a lot of Cursebreakers would probably break rank and just kind of take off into the night. So until you do that and become a wanted fugitive in the Harry Potter world, I think you're living a pretty upper middle class life. All right, and up next we have, whoa, what is that? That's right, you know it, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the second speed round of this video, because once again, there are just too many jobs that have literally no information about them except for being mentioned once. So, this is the second speed round. I'm gonna go through a couple more quick off the cuff. You can disagree with me if you want. Starting off the speed round with probably what would be a top suggestion from the crowd is the professional athlete. Now, I don't have a whole lot of athletes to base this off of. I basically only have Victor Crumb, who's 18 and a world superstar in Quidditch. So, based on that and based on the attendance to a stadium that seats 100,000 people, I have to imagine that he's probably compensated pretty well. I don't know what kind of endorsement deals people get in the wizarding world. I have to imagine they're at least somewhat reasonable. So all in, I think he's getting paid pretty well. The outlook for his job, probably not super great. He's gonna retire at some point, but everyone knows him. He's got some influence in the sporting world at least. And quite honestly, this is a pretty easy gig. So I'm giving this an 8. I'm giving this an upper class ranking. I think you're doing pretty well for yourself if you can manage to be a professional Quidditch nonsense sport player. Up next, we have an author. Again, something that I only have one example of basically, which is Lockhart. And he's a bit of a mixed bag himself because he's kind of just faking it completely. So I can't really trust anything he says. I think we have to base this off what would be an average author. And based on that, I think pretty quickly you'd come to the conclusion that this is a maybe middle class job, especially in a world where people don't seem to go to school past age 17. I don't really know how much anybody's reading in this world. Obviously Lockhart's popular, so I guess there's something like that. But again, he's a one-off. I think most authors in this world are, probably like most authors in the real world, sitting pretty squarely in the middle class. Again, making the assumption that you're at least somewhat successful, not just a self-published, no sales type of author. No offense to any of those people, but a successful, moderately successful author, I think, is sitting in the middle class. Portrait painters. This is an interesting one because I don't know if I'd want to deal with the moral hazard of this job. I think you're probably gonna have a pretty stable job. I think there's always going to be rich witches and wizards that want their portrait painted. So you're probably gonna have a job. They probably pay pretty reasonably well, assuming you're decent at painting. If you're like a bad painter, then I can't help you there, but probably not a bad gig, but probably not super comfortable. From the wild card perspective, I would probably give this a -1 just from the fact that you are trapping a soul within a painting for eternity, so that has its own set of moral quandaries for you if you go into this line of work. So I would give this one a working class ranking. I think this is probably like a 2-star type of ranking. Yeah. Something like that. And last, I have broom repair. This is maybe a catch-all for other types of repair type of roles, but it's one that I really wanted to talk about, mainly because I wanted to talk about the cost of brooms. I want to at least read the quote about the cost of a firebolt. "Who sent it to you?" said Ron in a hushed voice. "Look and see if there's a card," said Harry. Ron ripped apart the firebolt's wrappings. "Nothing. Blimey, who would spend that much on you?" "Well," said Harry, feeling stunned, "I'm betting it wasn't the Dursleys." "I bet it was Dumbledore," said Ron, now walking around and around the firebolts, taking in every glorious inch. "He sent you the invisibility cloak anonymously." "That was my dad's, though," said Harry. "Dumbledore was just passing it on to me. He wouldn't spend hundreds of galleons on me. He can't go giving students stuff like this." This is a really fascinating one for me because this is like the top of the line premium broom, and quite honestly, this is the one that people always cite as being like this exorbitant expense based on like the rest of the wizarding economy. How rich is Harry? He's like super rich, but potentially couldn't afford the firebolt himself, which I don't think is true. I don't frankly even think it's a big deal that Sirius Black bought this for him because a couple hundred galleons may sound like a lot, but again, if you're using my conversion rate, which at the very least is directional, we're talking, I don't know, $7,500. That is not that expensive. I'm willing to bet most of you with a used car paid more than $7,500 for it. That's not an expensive item, and that's like the top of the line thing here. And I mean, even further, when you think about Draco's dad buying Nimbus 2001s for the whole Slytherin team, how much would that be? I mean, if a firebolt is conservatively worth 500 galleons and Nimbus 2001s are worth less, I don't know, call it 250 galleons, and you buy, again, I don't know, are there 20 team members? There's got to be a few on the bench, whatever, call it 20. You're talking about 5,000 galleons, tops, which sounds, again, like a lot, but that is only 75K. And I get that that's a big number, but if we're talking about like the generational wealth of the Malfoys, 75K, that's nothing. So this is like such a strange part of the story because it's shown in a way that's like, these are the top of the line, most expensive things in this universe, and yet they're like the cost of a used car all the way up to like if you equip an entire children's school Quidditch team with top of the line brooms, it's like buying, I don't know, like it's like buying a sedan in 2025. It is not an insane purchase to make, especially if you allegedly have millions and millions and millions of dollars. 75 grand is nothing. So all that to say, back to what I would give the broom maker in this world, in this score. Realistically, I don't think the market is big enough for you to be raking in the galleons. You're in a skilled labor position. Quidditch is probably about as popular as it's ever going to be. I don't think your future is looking super bright here. And from an influence standpoint, Maybe if you're like the owner of the Firebolt company, you have influence on Quidditch sporting events. Maybe you own a team or something, but that's not the position we're talking about. We're talking about like the broom maker and the repair person. So realistically, I think this position is probably pretty low. I would give the broom maker repair person 1 star. I think they're probably working like pretty hard and not making a great living. I think this is a lower class position. Feel free to disagree with me if you want. Thanks for attending. That is the second speed round. And now let's move back to our regularly scheduled content. Hogwarts Professor. Moving on to a job that seemingly everyone wants to have in this world. It's the Hogwarts Professor. Dumbledore did it, Snape did it, McGonagall did it, even Voldemort wants to be a professor. The world's best and brightest want to be professors. But how good is this job in actuality? When we move into the cash factor, there's no other better way to start this than with a direct quote from Slughorn. They were at the front door when there was a shout from behind them. All right, I'll do it. Dumbledore turned to see Slughorn standing breathless in the doorway to the sitting room. You will come out of retirement. Yes, said Slughorn impatiently. I must be mad, but yes. Wonderful, said Dumbledore, beaming. Then, Horace, we shall see you on the 1st of September. Yes, I dare say you will, grunted Slughorn. As they set off down the garden path, Slughorn's voice floated after them. I will want a pay raise, Dumbledore. Dumbledore chuckled. The garden gate swung shut behind them, and they set off back down the hill through the dark and the swirling mist. Slughorn, who's this, adjunct professor, retired professor, the first thing he asks about coming back is a raise. And he talks about even later on the fact that they're not paid very well. It is maybe one of the only times we hear anything about how professors are compensated, but I think it's the most relevant thing we have. So fast forward to later in the book when Harry is, gulping down liquid luck and taking Slughorn to Hagrid's, and we hear a little bit more about Slughorn's plans to get rich. Touching, said Slughorn absent-mindedly, his large droopy eye fixed on the distant lights of Hagrid's cabin. But acromantula venom is very valuable. If the beast only just died, it might not have dried out yet. Of course, I wouldn't want to do anything insensitive if Hagrid is upset, but if there was any way to procure some... it's almost impossible to get venom from an acromantula when it's alive. Slughorn seemed to be talking more to himself than Harry now. Seems an awful waste not to collect it. Might get 100 galleons a pint. To be frank, my salary's not large. So again, this is one of the few moments where we have any real, tangible number assigned to the value of anything in this world. And 100 galleons a pint, roughly whatever that is, 10-ish times what Harry was going to pay for the brain drug earlier on. It's not nothing. That's, $1,500 for a pint. But is that enough to get Slughorn to commit this social faux pas of stealing the lifeblood venom out of this other professor's good friend, the spider? It's a bit of a faux pas, and he admits that. He says it's insensitive. So what I'm getting at is is $1,500 worth it to a professor? Because if they're getting compensated 200 grand, $1,500, I don't know if that's really at the top of your mind. If they're making 30 grand and being compensated with room and board, okay, yeah, $1,500 is a big portion of what your paycheck would be. I can understand why that is something you would be doing. With that in mind, what do we know about the structure of Hogwarts from a funding perspective? Basically, all we know is from what J.K. Rowling says is that there is no tuition fee. The Ministry of Magic covers the cost of all magical education, which means the professors, I believe, are just kind of public servants. I'm assuming they are paid essentially like what government workers are paid. Maybe a little bit more because it's the one magical school that teaches all their kids, so they're, I think they have some leg up there, but I don't think they're making really all that much. That said, they live at the castle potentially year-round, I'm not totally sure, so they don't have rent to pay for, they don't have food to pay for, they don't have to buy a broomstick necessarily to commute around. A lot of their costs are zero because they're provided by the school. So they have some pretty good benefits. And the last component I wanted to touch on with the cash section is whether or not certain professors are paid differently. There are different ranks. There are, normal professors, and then there are also like head of house professors like McGonagall and Snape. I would assume that they are somehow compensated more because they have tenure and experience and yada, yada, yada. But it brings up an interesting point, because I would imagine there's also some sort of performance bonus associated with them. And for example, what if they're compensated based on who wins the House Cup each year? And I know I've made up a completely hypothetical situation, but imagine that scenario where McGonagall could award points to her students and take away points from competing students. She might have a conflict of interest here. If you get like a 10% bonus if your house wins, I'd be giving out points left and right for like anything. I mean, especially the fact if you have Harry Potter in your house, who's the only one that gets to get the rewards of like fighting Voldemort. Not every other student gets to go fight the basilisk. No one else gets points for that kind of stuff. It seems pretty unfair, honestly, if you're anyone other than McGonagall in this situation. So all in, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I'm gonna give the cash factor 2 out of 3 here. Probably paid reasonably well, and there's a lot of benefits that come up with it. Moving on to the outlook of this position, there's 2 ways to approach it. One, you have something like Professor Binns, who dies and then continues to come to work as a ghost. I'm gonna assign that a rank of 1 out of 3, because if you're dying and still coming to work, not a good job. Bad job. I've got some other like facts to like inform the score here, but I feel like that's enough to give it a 1 out of 3, honestly. The other one is the fact that some of the jobs are cursed. For instance, the Defense Against the Dark Arts job is cursed. I don't know how you curse a job, but Voldemort does it. And the outcome is like pretty bad for every person that takes the position. There's death, there's like self-inflicted permanent memory damage. It doesn't go well for anybody. So that's not great for the outlook of your position either. Lastly, Hogwarts is one of like 3 schools in Europe. There's not a lot of room for teachers in this society. Like, we're talking, I don't know, like pretend you got 20 per school. Like, you got like less than 100 professors, I'm assuming, in Europe. All in, outlook-wise, I'm giving you a 1 out of 3. Not a great position. That said, the only thing that I think saves this position is the influence section. I think this is an area where seemingly everyone wants to be a professor, and it seems to offer all kinds of advantages. Again, let's look at Slughorn, for example. Yes, well, it is true that the prophet often exaggerates. Of course, Slughorn said, sounding a little disappointed. I remember dear Gwenog telling me, Gwenog Jones, of course, captain of the Holyhead Harpies. He meandered off into a long-winded reminiscence, but Harry had the distinct impression that Slughorn had not finished with him, and that he had not been convinced by Neville and Ginny. The afternoon wore on with more and more anecdotes about illustrious wizards Slughorn had taught, all of whom had been delighted to join what he called the Slug Club at Hogwarts. If you play this game right, I think you have an outsized amount of influence on society. Not only do you have connections to witches and wizards that go on to areas of greatness, because everyone pretty much has to take your class if you do something important at Hogwarts, so you have connections, and so you can maintain those and use them to your advantage later in life. That could be the head of a Quidditch team, but I can imagine that would also be something like the Ministry of Magic. Hogwarts is the center of influence in this society, and so I do really think this is reasonably a 3 out of 3. 3 out of 3? 3 out of 3 for influence. Lastly, for the wild card nonsense section, I realistically should give this a -1 just for the occupational hazards that come up with Hogwarts. This school has been bombarded by deadly things every year since this one kid showed up. So realistically, not a very safe workplace, not OSHA approved at all. That said, I do think the fact that you're so close to all the happenings going on in the world, maybe this is specific to the time when Harry is at Hogwarts, I'll let you have a 0 for this one, a -1 or a 0. So all in, that gives you between a 5 and a 6 on your score here, which does kind of bridge the gap here between the working class and the middle class section. I'd lean towards middle class for a professor. I think that's pretty reasonable. Minister of Magic. The Minister of Magic was high on my intent to rank here. I thought this one would probably be one of the more interesting jobs to try to assign a value to. Then I think it kind of holds up. As I dug more and more into this, I really think the Minister of Magic job is really not a great position. You're basically the head of a failing state, always in chaos, always responding to things going wrong. Doesn't sound like a great job, but before I get ahead of myself, let's jump in. From a cash perspective, this is probably your saving grace here. I think you are probably the highest paid public official in the government. So, off the bat, I would give you a 3 out of 3 for cash. You probably don't have to pay for much out of your own pocket. You're probably given a place to live. Your cash goes so far, but I really think you're probably not paying for much on a day-to-day basis. So I'm giving, very quickly, to move on to the more interesting parts, I'm giving the cash a 3 out of 3. From an outlook perspective, also a pretty short section because I think it's pretty bad. You are always walking around with a target on your back, I think. At least when there's someone like Voldemort on the loose, which seemingly happens whether or not it's Voldemort or the next dark wizard that takes over. There's a constant stream of dark wizards that are more powerful than the last and just sort of ready to commit atrocities and take over the world. So I think it's always a bad position to be in. You are always at risk here. I'm giving you a 1 out of 3 for the outlook score, purely based on the danger to your life on a day-to-day basis. But to get into the really interesting one, we move on to the influence section. There's a bunch of things I wanted to talk about here. So first of all, I wanted to talk about the idea of monetary policy in this world and the economic reality of a system that's controlled by Gringotts. There's this interesting little tidbit that's talking about fudge when it's in the Quibbler magazine in Order of the Phoenix, I think. Sources close to the minister have recently disclosed that Fudge's dearest ambition is to seize control of the goblin gold supplies, and that he will not hesitate to use force if need be. It wouldn't be the first time either, said a ministry insider. Cornelius Goblin Crusher Fudge, that's what his friends call him. If you could hear him when he thinks no one's listening, he's always talking about the goblins he had done in. He's had them drowned, he's had them dropped off buildings, he's had them poisoned, he's had them cooked in pies. Now, this is obviously hyperbole from a National Enquirer type of magazine, so it can't be totally true. But that said, it would not surprise me if Fudge was trying to actively seize control of Gringotts. The Harry Potter universe, wizarding universe as a whole, doesn't control its own currency. It's completely at the whims of the goblins. And there's different things probably keeping these two parties working together. But if Fudge saw an opportunity to take control of the monetary functions of society, I think he definitely would. He's essentially trying to create a central bank for the wizarding world, or at the very least, nationalize the one that exists by, poisoning or doing whatever he wants to do with all the goblins. For instance, he can't just print more money if he has to fund a war. There are limits to what he can do when the wizard society is running on someone else's currency. This is something that happens in the real world. So I don't think it's unreasonable that Fudge would be trying to take control of Gringotts and the gold supply. Simultaneously, this is a weird job because he's doing stuff like this, like trying to set up a central bank, but then he also shows up to the trial for a wizard doing underage magic. You're kind of doing the both extremes of the spectrum in terms of your responsibilities, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. One other point that I wanted to talk about, which was interesting, is the ability for the Minister of Magic to sort of interfere in the rest of the world's affairs, outside of the Harry Potter universe. To the Prime Minister of Muggles, urgent we meet. Kindly respond immediately. Sincerely, Fudge. The man in the painting looked inquiringly at the Prime Minister. Said the Prime Minister. Listen, it's not a very good time for me. I'm waiting for a telephone call, you see, from the president of... That could be rearranged, said the portrait at once. The Prime Minister's heart sank. He'd been afraid of that. But I really was rather hoping to speak. We shall arrange for the president to forget to call. He will telephone tomorrow night instead, said the little man. Kindly respond immediately to Mr. Fudge. So, it appears as though wizards can freely modify the wishes and intentions of muggles for whatever they need to do, which is a level of influence that I think is really quite a bit larger than what you might first assume with the Minister of Magic. You might think he's just confined to the magical world portion of stuff, but realistically, he's controlling presidents of foreign countries and wiping their memories or rearranging them or whatever. But that would be cause for World War III if it happened nowadays. And they just kind of do it on a whim. His assistant does it on a whim. So very clearly and obviously, the Minister of Magic gets a 3 out of 3 for influence. So 3 for cash, 1 for outlook, 3 for influence. The wildcard section, again, this one's kind of up and down. On one hand, you are kind of in constant danger of assassination, but you're probably surrounded by quite a bit of security. But on the other hand, you have access and benefits and perks that pretty much no one else in society gets. So based on that, based on the fact that you don't have to pay for anything, based on the fact that you have influence over the global state of affairs, I think you have to give them a +1 for the nonsense wildcard section here, bringing our total up to an 8 out of 10, which puts you squarely, I think, in the upper class section. You have completely limitless influence over the world, you're compensated probably pretty well, and the only real trade-off is probably stress and target on your back occasionally, or often, but all in, upper class seems reasonable to me. Headmaster. This is probably the one that everyone was waiting for. The Headmaster of Hogwarts, Albus Dumbledore, and presumably anyone else that becomes the Headmaster, but pretty much Albus Dumbledore. Let's just dive right into it. Starting, of course, with the cash factor. This one, I think, has a range of components to it. First of all, you get all the perks of a normal professor would have at Hogwarts, so you're not really paying for housing or food or any of your other expenses. I think that's all pretty much covered. But also, as the headmaster of the school, you're definitely being paid the most out of any of these professors. And based on other factors like your influence, you probably have access to all other types of resources that most people just do not have. You are directly tied into the top of the government because, again, for whatever reason, Hogwarts is the center of the wizarding universe, so you have a lot of benefits and perks that come along with that. This headmaster job, I think, so long as you are a wizard or witch powerful enough to support the sort of reverence that this position has, I really think that you are the most influential, powerful, compensated person in the wizarding universe. So I'm giving the cash a 3 out of 3, and we'll move on to the outlook section. You are basically unimpeachable. There is nothing you can do to jeopardize your position, seemingly no matter what. Dumbledore runs tournaments where children die and nothing happens to him. Maybe that's because he's Dumbledore, maybe it's because he's the headmaster, maybe it's a mix of both. And I can hear the comments. I know that's not totally true. They try to capture him at one point. You have to cross some pretty hard lines in the sand for the Minister of Magic to really personally come to your office and try to subdue you. And even when that happens, you have connections with all the orders and everyone else. And I get it. It was like the Order of the Phoenix members and everything, but still, you have so much influence and power that you are basically untouchable. The other part of this would be like a little bit of chicken and the egg. I think by the time you're the headmaster, you realistically have accumulated quite a bit of personal magical prowess, to the point where even if someone wanted to attack you or you did have a target on your back, you're powerful in a way that I don't think that target matters quite as much, if that makes sense. Don't be silly, Dawlish, said Dumbledore kindly. I'm sure you're an excellent orb, and I seem to remember that you achieved outstanding in all your newts, but if you attempt to, bring me in by force, I will have to hurt you. The man called Dawlish blinked, looking rather foolish. He looked toward Fudge again, but this time seemed to be hoping for a clue as to what to do next. So, sneered Fudge, recovering himself, you intend to take on Dawlish, Shacklebolt, Dolores, and myself single-handed, do you, Dumbledore? Merlin's beard, no, said Dumbledore smiling. Not unless you're foolish enough to force me to. Again, this is probably a little specific to Dumbledore and not so much the headmaster position, I get it, but I think anyone that finds themselves in this headmaster position probably has accumulated a pretty sizable amount of personal power and an ability to compose themselves in this way, in this scenario, and come out unscathed. So from an outlook perspective, very much easily a 3 out of 3. From an influence perspective, I've already touched on it a few times. I don't even know what other details I really need to include here. The influence you have as the headmaster of Hogwarts, which again is the center of influence in this entire world, is very obviously peak within this society. You have a 3 out of 3 plus influence in this realm. You are like God to these people. You have a level of political and economical and societal control that I think no one else in society, not even the Minister of Magic, has. So 3 out of 3 for your influence score there. And lastly, your wild card nonsense score. You probably see where this is going, but just to spell it out for you, you have access to the kind of secrets and magical knowledge that no one else in society has. We don't get to know about what's in the Department of Mysteries, but I bet that Dumbledore knows. I bet Dumbledore knows things that people in the Department of Mysteries don't even know that they're working on. Like, he probably understands things that they've been trying to figure out the whole time. And that could be because it's Dumbledore, but that could just be because of the influence and knowledge that he has because of the position that he's in. Not only that, but you probably have access to other types of accoutrements that improve your magical prowess, like random artifacts and knowledge of new spells and resources to test magic and all that kind of stuff. You have complete control and access to as the headmaster. So wildcard has to be a +1 for the headmaster. There just isn't any other way, which, if you've been counting along, puts us at our final and only perfect score on this entire video, a 10 out of 10. This is the ruling class type of position at Hogwarts. Maybe it's a little cliche, but I honestly, after going through all these jobs, don't think there is another position or job that is like this. I can hear the pushback and I understand it. Dumbledore probably does not have the gold that the Malfoys have, or the Blacks, or, he's not maybe quite as loaded as some old money families in society. But that said, that money, it hasn't been earned based on a salary. It's just like old money. It's like royalty money. And as much as I think that's interesting and might be something that I look into in the future, I was talking about jobs here. So Nepo babies, not counting them, okay? So all in, I think realistically, headmaster, top scores for everything, 10 out of 10. This is maybe the one and only ruling class job on the whole list. Don't like it? Tell me about it in the comments. And that does it. I've ranked a whole bunch of jobs. I really thought this was going to be a somewhat shorter video, but as I started recording, it just kind of kept going more and more, and there was a lot to talk about. So I hope you enjoyed it. You might not have agreed with everything on my list, but you can certainly let me know about it in the comments. If you like that video, I've made a couple others you might like this one or this one about magical items, or really anything else on my channel. Go check them out. A couple other quick reminders. You can check out the Discord. You can check out memberships on the channel. You can check out the Patreon, all that kind of stuff down in the description below. That's it for me. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.